So today with us, we have Professor Anneli Ekblom. She's a professor in archaeology and global environmental history at Uppsala University. She's an archaeologist by training with an interest in landscape history and conservation, and as such has worked on conservation issues in Southern African national parks and cross-border and community approaches, but also outside national parks. She has combined archaeobotanical and paleoecological tools to reconstruct landscape history, focusing on human-environment relationships ranging from the very physicality of the landscape changes in flora and climate to the social parts of conflicts, contestations, when it comes to conservation and heritage. While a lot of her work has focused on Southern Africa, she's also worked in Sweden and elsewhere. She's the driving force behind the organization Integrated History and Future for People on Earth, so IHOPE. And you can find out more on ihopenet.org. And this organization is also with whom we're running the seminar series. She runs an interdisciplinary master's program in global environmental history. She's a key member of a research and teaching network between Uppsala University and universities in Mozambique, and was a member of the Center for Biological Diversity run by Uppsala and SLU, to just name a few of her roles. And with that very quick introduction, I'm passing it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Nick, and it's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to meet you all. So the title of today's talk is Landscape History, Archaeology and Storytelling. And I actually had a IHOPE PR slide here. So we have just recently opened up or clarified membership in IHOPE, so anyone can affiliate yourselves to IHOPE and also engage in our activities. And we hope to have many, many more hearts here by having you all affiliating your projects to IHOPE. And as Nick said, we also have two seminar series, the Lashes and the Afres series. And the next event is on the 6th of June. This time, so 17 UK time. And we're probably also going to organize a lunch seminar, which I think we will call lunches, and to play with the same theme. But now over to the topic of today's talk. So I began this talk with a slide showing the Macchia, the Mediterranean Macchia landscape. And with a quote from Jeanette Winterson's written on the body, "Why is the measure of love loss?" And it's a quote myself and Michel Notelid used when we wrote about Arcadia and the idea of the Arcadian landscape in a Swedish book. Where we were discussing the debate around deforestation in the Greek landscape, based largely on Oliver Rackham's work and his critique against the deforestation debate. And the point of that paper was really to say that by obsessing with an idea about a landscape, we have kind of almost accidentally lost the highly biodiverse landscape of the Macchia, which we are now understanding is a biological hotspot, and it's a perfectly adapted Mediterranean landscape. So to me, this goes to show, or this kind of symbolizes the importance of how and in what form and what content we tell stories about landscapes and landscape history, because we have a lot of pre-understanding about landscapes already. And as archaeologists, paleoecologists, or historians, I think we need to work better at writing landscape history and telling those stories. I will come back to that. later on. So I think we also need to work better at telling the historical narrative in a way that we show the engagement between humans, nature, and fellow organisms as an intimate relationship, sometimes, debated, contested, and so on, but still as a history where humans and fellow beings have been a part. And I know Stefania Barca, for instance, has written rather critical discussions on the use of Anthropocene in today's academic discourse and also outside academia. That debate tends to be a rather anthropocentric one, and also a Eurocentric one, and I think she's right in that. And many people in other parts of the world find that debate very alien. And she has worked a lot with, say, labor organizations or local communities in kind of changing the discourse around climate change and environmental change. So as Nick said, I've been had the privilege of coordinating an international and interdisciplinary master program in global environmental history. And one of the first slides I showed them in the first course is this one. I'm saying that this is a program and a course that will help you think the world relationally. And it's rather difficult to do because throughout our whole academic education, we have been taught to think the world in a fragmentary way. So it is a challenge to learn to see the world relationally. And I'd say in the last couple of years, many of our students have been very inspired by the work, for instance, by Anna Löwenat-Singh et al. That stresses the importance of stories, new stories, and narratives to kind of show the engagement and entanglement between humans, fellow organisms, and landscapes in various ways for what they call radical hope. I think we might come back to that in the discussion. And they also use the concept of modular simplification and feral proliferation, which I used in the abstract for this. I will use those concepts later on. So I don't have time. If I had more time, I would give some examples of some of the really interesting work of our students, but I won't have time. I only have time to raise a few. So one example is a study by Charlotte Vredenbrecht, who wrote about the godwits and the management of godwits in the Dutch landscape. So the godwit is the national bird of Netherlands, and the godwit since the Netherlands Dutch landscape was transformed with the building of the polders, the very soft soil of those polders was conducive to godwits and also other wetland birds. And you can see that type of landscape here. Below you can see the modern day landscape, which is truly a modular simplification of landscape when that was shaped when the Dutch transitioned to dairy farming, and the cattle was trampling these very soft soils, and there was also an expansion of growing grass for fodder for the cattle, so really heavy machinery that compacted the soils, and now the godwits can't live here anymore. So what Garrod did was he interviewed farmers who dedicated their lives to create environments for these godwit birds. And I have an extract here from his thesis. It's a conversation between both a farmer managing fields for the birds and Garrod and Bote's wife. And Bote is basically telling Garrod that when I started with this, to be honest, like I was caught in a rat race. So, and that's what all the farmers he interviewed was saying. So once you started to expand, you have no choice. You have to go bigger. That's the only way to do it. I didn't want to do that. And I heard about this nature conservation area that gave you payments to reserve some land for the godwits. So Bote went in for the money, basically. But what happened was that he discovered a new world. And he actually described sitting on the now light tractor, being outside in the field, hearing the birds, experiences his farm in a new way, which to him was transforming. And of course, he went absolutely, he fell in love with the godwits, basically. And you can see that in this conversation. But of course, that also has costs. And that's the conversation they're having here in the kitchen. So what is the point of this story, or telling this story about the intimate relationship between godwits, farmers, and landscape transformation? I think the point simply, and that is something that Van Doren and Bird Rose, who has written similar studies on, we can call it extinction studies, so about animals, humans, and landscapes together. The point is really simply to evoke a response. So do we feel this longing and loss and also love for the other species? And I think it really works. But why is it important? So to me, we have a very strange way of thinking about nature and thinking about the wilderness. So we're still thinking about wilderness and nature as if it was Arcadia, a landscape that doesn't really exist. And one symbolic representation of that is, of course, the forest. So I think in Europe, we are forest crazy. The forest has become like almost a Jungian archetype of what we think is the wild primeval landscape. And that has nothing to do really with landscape history. It has to do with our imaginations. And that image is now affecting also other parts of the world. But if we look at the concept of biodiversity, and I think it's a very good concept, precisely because it's difficult to define. It's always, we have to have a negotiation about what biodiversity, where. If we look at Europe and the European landscapes, many of the landscapes where we have highest amount of red listed species are old cultural landscapes. So to manage for biodiversity, we have to continue with old practices to manage these landscapes. So we can't abandon them. They have to be carefully and continuously managed. Yes, wait. I will soon move to give you a few examples in Sicily, but we will begin in the north of Sweden. And the point with all of these two examples is really to stress home that in Europe, the biggest challenge or the biggest risk when it comes to biodiversity protection is really rural abandonment. So the fact that people are abandoning the rural areas, which means that these practices so important for biodiversity are being discontinued. So if we move to Jämtland County in the north of Sweden, these two images show pictures of the same landscape. So this is historical, I think it's from the 1950s or something, and this is this landscape today. These pictures are taken from a film and that was produced by Explorative Imaginaries, a rather poetic film about landscape change. You can watch it on YouTube. So when you interview people in this area, they will tell you that they experience a degradation of the landscape precisely because of these old fields and landscapes are now being overgrown by a forest. And around this region, because of rural abandonment, there's also forest plantations. This area was in the past a center for many reasons. So we had the forestry that was very big in this region. And it was also an area where they had these shielding systems. So outland management systems that with meadow practices that are also very important for biodiversity. And these practices have now been discontinued because of rural abandonment. In this area, there has been archaeological projects for many, many years. So I think even 30 years ago they started and was ongoing intensively for 10 years. And this resulted in the building of a county museum or a local museum, a forest museum. In this area, all the shops have kind of closed because there are too few people. So this museum, the Forest Museum, has become the new center of the village. So people usually come there on weekends and hang with Marco, who is making this traditional food called kålbullar. He counts tourists in number of kålbullar sold. And he also tells the story. He's actually from East Germany. And if you watch the film, you will hear him say that what attracts him to this landscape is the freedom, the closeness to nature. And he ends with saying a rather hopeful reflection on the fact that people are actually moving in, or that's what they are feeling now. We don't know, so I think partly because of also this heritage history, and it's a popular area, and also many non-Swedes have started ecotourism ventures and so on in this area. So as I said, there's been archaeological projects here for a long time, and the latest one is a project where Carl-Johan Lindholm, my colleague, is a PI. I was also involved in that, where the aim was to trace outland practices archaeologically and also in the pollen records. And this illustration shows the map shows an illustration of like the layered practices of the outland landscape. So if you look at, for instance, archaeological sites, you see a lot of different types of archaeological sites here that have been overlaid over time. And if we look at the pollen record, we haven't published the results yet. You can also see a greater diversity in these outland areas because of all these different activities. We have a huge conflict in Sweden over forest management. European Union is actually suing the Swedish state because of our insistence, or the forest industry's insistence, of clear cutting So our boreal forests are not very biodiverse. They are like the complete opposites to biodiverse. But in these old shielding areas, there are like residual memories of the old biodiversity, which we hope could be reinvigorated. So I switched now to Sicily as promised, and a project that I am involved in together with Vincenza, who is with us now. Wave Vincenza, yes. And we also see her picture here. So the project in Sicily looks at the historical ecology of olive. And as you know, olives can become very old. So we have this olive giant here, which is from Vincenza's olive orchard. Vincenza is an olive farmer herself. And these olives are hosts to a lot of insects and animals. And the only reason why this olive has grown so old is because of continuous care. So pruning every year. Otherwise, the olive will not survive. So in Vincenza's project, the olive now is the agent. So we're tracing the different spatialities and temporal trajectories of olive cultivation systems. So from the wild olive cultivation to the Roman system to the medieval Muslim-inspired system that had a lot of intercropping with fruit trees and other changes. And what is interesting with this project, I think, is that all of these landscape memories can be found in one and the same landscape. So by looking at the alignment of olive trees, you can also see these land use systems all at once. Vincenza, you can develop later, if I didn't explain. So since the Garrod seminar series is about scale, I think it's a really good example also. So we will use a lot of different methods. So everybody says it's impossible to date olive trees using tree rings, but we're giving it a shot anyway, trying it out. We will also use, of course, archaeology and take soil samples to look at phytoliths to see, and also isotopes to see if we can see changes in olive management systems over time. And we're all experimenting on Vincenza's old farm because we know the history of that one. So it's in her backyard. But to me, the reason why this project is so exciting is the very applied aspect of what we are doing. And that is through the communications with olive farmers in Sicily, in this region. And we're going to work in more regions to kind of map the traditional knowledge of olive farmers. And just to take a practical example, the pruner told us the story about that there are very few pruners. There are very few that have that knowledge and skill. And that's something that we hope could be an outcome also to, for instance, have training courses for youth to become olive pruners. I'm just imagining things now, Vincenza, we could do. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of connections we can make also, for instance, when it comes to a new interest in local foods and locally produced food. So One example is the Slow Food Organization and their Presidia projects. There are 627 Presidia projects in 79 different countries that are all heritage foods or plants or animals that are being marketed through this organization. And one of our students interviewed some people, some representatives from local presidias, and many of them stressed that it's really, we're not in this for the money, we're not in this for the market, we are in this because it's living heritage and it's a knowledge we want to maintain. And of course, the heritage stories is very important in this practice. I also had a student that interviewed Swedish farmers on who were growing heritage plants. And again, the story about those heritage plants are really important. It's a really strong driving force for them to engage in these activities. So one problem is often when you work in these projects that by the time you're really getting, you have worked in an area for many, many years with landscape history, archaeology, and etc. And by the time you feel that, oh, now I can really say something about how this knowledge could be used, your money is gone and the project has ended. A month ago, I put in a proposal to kind of continue to build in areas where we have worked for many years. You see Ängesjö is here, the Morello Valley, so Vincenzo's project is here. And the idea is to make what we call local collaboratories, difficult to say, where we will kind of use the historical knowledge and the connections that we have built to have discussions about future sustainability and how to engage people in local innovation in and through these conversations. I will come back more to this project in the end. So I have been working together with my colleague Michelle Notelid for many years in Limpopo National Park, and Limpopo National Park was also included in this project that we are calling Livabilities. So we hope to get continued funding. So the project is interdisciplinary, even though we are very few in the project, looking at both the negotiations of the creation of the park itself. It was created in 2002, but also archaeology and oral history, as also paleoecology. And I think we've actually spent most of our time in documenting oral history. And that has been very important because some villages will move from the park. They have been offered a resettlement package. And there was concern amongst local leaders about that they would lose the knowledge of history, because history is so intimately tied to ceremonial places in this landscape. So by not having these places nearby, or by not having access to them, it was feared that the history would be lost. So we've done quite a lot of work in documenting the lineage histories of the traditional leaders, and those lineage histories are important because they are the traditional leaders are resource owners to the whole community. So as part of the project, we also try to trace then the long-term human-animal relationships. And one example is cattle. And again, the combination of cattle, tsetse and landscape changes. And those connections, I think, are important to stress home the fact that the landscape has been carefully managed over time. to be conducive for cattle herding. So one thing that farmers knew very well in the past was that if you let the grasslands become overgrown by too much shrub, you get the tsetse fly, and then your cows will die, and it will also affect wildlife. So this knowledge has kind of been maintained over centuries, but in fact, it's a knowledge that is now risking to become forgotten, because when we are building national parks or nature reserves, we go all in for forests. And that will have detrimental effects both to wildlife, cattle, and also domestic cattle, of course. I said before that we have a very problematic view of the wild or of nature, and that is perhaps epitomized, I think, in the African continent and our view of the savanna. So for a long time, the savannas were seen as degraded. And as landscape historians, we know that that is not the fact. Now we've done pollen analysis across many parts of the African continent. We know that the climate has changed a lot, and that forests and savannas have kind of expanded and contracted with large-scale climate changes. So during the Holocene, it got wetter, forest expanded. In periods when it got drier, savannas expanded. And this is completely without human involvement. It's a natural process. But this knowledge seems to be so easily forgotten. So conservation in Africa, in some areas, risks becoming a modular simplification of landscape. And I think we have to think carefully about how come this landscape I'm pointing at here can be called ecological restoration. What stories lies behind this description of a forest plantation of eucalyptus, in this case, in Africa, to be called environmental restoration? So this is one of these climate mitigation forests, the REDD+ forests. So these type of environmental or ecological restoration projects obviously has nothing to do with biodiversity. The savannas are already biodiverse, and they also bind a lot of carbon, and we haven't even begun to study or to understand how carbon is bound in ground. A lot of the calculations when it comes to the REDD forest plantations is based only on above ground storage. These stories also have, of course, implications for how we think about local farmers and their competence. So if you Google smart agriculture in Africa, there's now like, I don't know, 20,000 hits or something, all projects dedicated to make African farmers climate smart and resilient. And I would say, well, they are already very climate smart and resilient. So we should ask them how they manage, basically. I think still we do have a big problem in stressing home the knowledge of landscape history in Africa. So we must work much more. I think, maybe it will take 50 years, but we can't stop trying. And one example, I think, is the rather ironic example of the Google forest. And Anselmo Matus wrote a PhD thesis about this forest. He's with us in the meeting, which was discovered by Kew Garden foresters using Google, and it got very much publicized, as this is a quote from one of the papers, as the last untouched and unexplored wilderness on Earth. Anselmo Matus shows very elegantly, I think, that what the Kew Garden specialist saw as the last untouched wilderness, the local community sees as Mount Meru, a mountain which has been locally protected and venerated for centuries. So it's a cultural landscape. So for many years, I kind of tried to publish on landscape history and problematize this very persistent image of landscape degradation in Africa. And it's really difficult actually to get those publications through. One reviewer said that we were idealizing locust farmers' competence, which I don't think we were doing. But I think that's the reason why we switched over to use the concept of biocultural heritage, because it simply was easier to write about this using this framework. So in this paper, we kind of collected all examples where there were local practices and a combination of biological studies that could show that a positive relationship between local practices and biodiversity. And we also have a PhD project ongoing now that is looking into locally protected areas in Mozambique, in the Injamban region. Let's see if I have. Yeah, so he's using different methods, so paleoecology sampling, archaeology as well, and also remote sensing to map these forests. And what he could show is that if you look at the forest patches in Injamban, it is actually the forest patches that are under customary protection that have been more stable over time. So you can see one example of this forest patch here that are strictly under local protection through customary rules. And again, the reason why I'm excited about this project is because it has a really applied connection to, so in discussing with local community and local leaders that are resource protectors here, we can also discuss how to strengthen the protection of these forests. So one problem that local communities and traditional leaders are facing is the fact that the customary law works. There is a customary protection that is quite efficient, as I showed before. But if the government or the province gives out concessions for, say, logging, then the traditional leaders can't do anything because they don't have formal ownership. They don't have land deeds on these forests. And there's a lot of illegal logging ongoing all the time. So while we were working, I visited Pascual last year, you could actually hear the chainsaws in the background, and we met trucks going out from these forests with timber. So I'm soon wrapping up. So I go back to Jeremias Baloy, who last time we visited him in December 2019, said to us, I don't want anyone to forget about Bingo. And that's the village that they are moving from now. And we're writing a book now on this Limpopo National Park project, where the Bingo story is kind of the key. It's the thread that weaves everything together. But Jeremias Baloy also reminds us about another thing, and that is how we tell the stories. So obviously writing an academic book or academic papers won't really go down so well to the local community. And I think we need to think carefully about how and in what form we communicate our knowledge to local communities. So one thing I have been thinking about is to kind of, maybe we should do it as an oral tradition or something, the same way as they narrate lineage history or something like that. But there is a lot of experimentation we need to think about. So I come back to the project I drafted a month ago. It's now in review, and it was a bit of an experiment. It's called the Livabilities, and the idea was to work with these local collaborators in areas where myself or colleagues have been working for many years. So we would use that local connection to also work with artists and say having food fairs or workshops showing how to prune olives, or a combination of many different activities. And in the project, as we designed it, we would also have a wandering exhibition called The Wandering, which would travel between the collaborators. And as part of that, we were also adding an online project that is called the Climate Diaries, so an oral testimony of living with climate change and biodiversity loss, or in the wake of projects that are mitigating these effects. So as I've shown here, biodiversity loss could actually come in Africa from red plus plantation. And I think that this would be driven by local communities. So probably the stories would be very different. They might not be about climate change or biodiversity loss at all, but perhaps about rural abandonment or other issues that they find important to express. So yeah, that's still my dream project. I think some of this can actually be done through collaborations, especially the Climate Diaries. I think we could use the IHOPE network to start make that happening through our existing collaborations. And I finished there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We now open the floor to questions. So please either raise your hand or put it in the chat. But I will start this off by asking then, so you mentioned that in Europe or in the West, we perceive the forest as this kind of the peak of nature, so to say. But how do, for example, other communities that you've been working with perceive forests? How do they talk about it? Is it equally so venerated just ideologically, or is it seen as something problematic?
Good question. So I did interview for my PhD thesis. I interviewed the local community in coastal Mozambique about landscape change, and everybody was telling me about this forest that used to be there and the mythical creatures that were. So I don't think it's a European thing. I think that it's an archetype, basically. because when I did the pollen analysis, that forest actually, there used to be a forest there, but it had disappeared like hundreds of years ago. So I don't know if we interview people, I invite Maria in Bolivia, would they also give you stories about the large forest that used to be there? Yeah.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm happy to kind of follow on, because I don't see any raised hands or videos. We're finished.
Yes, sorry, can I ask? Thank you, Anneli, as always, very, very inspiring. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more about this problem of the imaginary of a landscape, or what we think sort of a landscape that is conserved and healthy should look like. And on that score, whether perhaps you can share your experience about thinking perceptions that are being created in the global south today. So, you know, we all are very familiar with colonial sort of derived ideas, etc. But now I'm thinking about how development agencies that are born in the global south are actually promoting, more or less, sort of perpetuating ideas about landscape health, that, you know, this how did you call it? Modular simplification, which I thought was very elegant. So yeah, can you perhaps, yeah.
So yeah, I think so. For I and that's something, is an open question, right? I feel that so before we started with discussing climate mitigation, I felt that landscape history had made an impact on how we discussed African landscapes. But with climate mitigation, it's like all of that was erased, because biodiversity has kind of been put under, like completely forgotten, in favor of the RED projects and similar projects. That's the impression I have, and I haven't. We would need a student that actually tested that but I think that's what happened. And somehow, like I was giving a class on this, and we were discussing with the other teachers of the course. So they had a lot of lectures about the importance of planting forests. And I was trying to say, well, you know, it has nothing to do with biodiversity, but no one ever questions that. It's like, as long as you plant forests, it's good for the environment. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, things like the Great Green Wall.
Yeah, yes.
Anyway, sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, if you plant forest in the Sahel, probably the trees will die because they won't survive. So we'll see what happens. But I'm glad one of the specialists on savannas, William Bond, has now started writing quite activist papers, stressing precisely what I have been talking about here, that the savannas are biodiverse and they store a lot of carbon. So, and important for wildlife movements as well.
Thank you.
We have two questions. So Junko, if you go first.
Hold hold on. I can't get my video working
A
somehow.
beautiful forest you're showing us.
Oh, thank you. That is Japanese Satoyama landscape. Why isn't it working? Is a big question. Sorry, but I guess we can live with this. So thank you, Anneli. Oops. So something really wrong happened. So your presentation about forest without biodiversity, that's very similar to the Japanese situation, and it's fascinating. So my question is about small-scale agriculture over there. You showed us some of the efforts, examples of small-scale farmers, but I'd love to learn more about the current agricultural practice over there. To what extent these new attempts are part of the larger context over there? Like, is that something that larger scale, big companies coming in and small scale farmers are getting smaller in number, or is that is there a big body of group of small scale farmers who are actually practicing?
Good question. So I have some students that did interviews, as I said, with small scale, so ecological farmers. In this case, it was with heritage plants. But so far, I mean, the European Union Common Agricultural Policy have been edited to be more conducive towards management for biodiversity. Previously, it was very much steering farmers into industrial agriculture, but that policy has now changed. But the farmers that my students interview are saying, also the Presidia farmers are saying that like there is no policy for small-scale farmers. The only way to get benefits from European Union is to be big. And most of the time, small-scale farmers are simply too small to be able to qualify for those payments. But many farmers also say that they don't want payments. Like they don't want to engage in that. They want to be, independent. And I feel also that there is a market for that in Sweden. Vincenza is actually one of those farmers herself, but in Sicily. But I think it's an interest we can grow much more, and the heritage story is very important in the marketing also.
I see. Well, sounds quite similar in Japan in a way. The scale is smaller, but we are really trying to figure out how to promote small scale farming, but in relation to maintaining diversity. So we should talk more.
We should talk more.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Paul. Yes, your question.
Thanks, Anneli. My camera doesn't seem to be working. Really interesting and fascinating talk as always. My question really is we're in the UN's decade for ecosystem restoration, and I wonder whether you've reflected on the approach at all that they're taking. And I mean, because there seems to be a slight mismatch that on the one hand, UNESCO now are picking up on this concept of biocultural heritage in some of their policies. Yet, from what I could see in the way in which the UN sort of, even their 10 principles of ecosystem restoration, although they acknowledge local context and local knowledge and so forth, they still seem to maintain a culture-nature binary in that. And I just wonder whether you've at all looked at that and thought about how one might shift in this decade in which the UN is placing some emphasis on ecosystem restoration to engage a little bit more with the idea of biocultural heritage.
Good question. I haven't really, so I haven't read those. I should probably do that. So maybe the easy answer then is to, well, look at biodiversity. Use that instead of talking about ecological restoration and plant a forest and call it ecological restoration. Look at the biodiversity and measure that. I mean, then we might find that the biodiverse landscapes also in Africa is the landscapes that are shifting agriculture, landscapes where you have a lot of, you know, a mosaic of different land use systems and bridges between them and so on.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of an unfair question to put you on the spot. That you should know the details of the but I'm just always struck by this kind of disconnect that often happens even in different agencies. You know, on the one hand, the UN, you know, UNESCO is looking at biocultural diversity and biocultural heritage, and yet another really powerful agency is still maintaining this sort of nature culture binary. And I just more generally, I wonder whether you have any ideas about how one shifts that conception, particularly amongst the sort of, I guess, the ecologists and the wildlife conservationists.
Yeah, so one way is simply by insisting on publishing landscape histories that permanently like brings home the message, because obviously it hasn't, I mean, we need to do a lot more work there. And I'm thinking with the Convention of Biological Diversity actually puts a lot of stress on traditional ecological knowledge and so on. And it's been in place for a long, long time now. So I think the disconnect is, again, maybe what we are seeing is that a shift that we have kind of forgotten a bit about biodiversity because of the climate change discourse. And that, yeah, I don't know if you agree or.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. The need for carbon capture and all of those that other sort of rhetoric has subsumed an earlier concern with sustaining and maintaining biodiversity. Yeah.
Great. We have a few more minutes for one more question, if there is one more. Yeah, Fede.
Yeah, sorry, just to follow up quickly, perhaps also what you are doing together with Vincenza in Sicily. I'm thinking about the discovery or the sort of the dissemination of the economic as much as a sort of environmental value of promoting small scale resource management. I mean, obviously the olive tree is a sort of is a golden a golden plant to do in the southern, in the Mediterranean in general. But I think that might spearhead an example, because we have similar features in other type of continents and environments and climate.
Yes.
So.
And it's a good point, and it connects also to Paul's. So one avenue where we can do that, I think, is to the green economy that European Union likes, and actually smart agriculture. So we can take those concepts and kind of say, this is how you do it. There's also increasing talk about at European Union level about creative industries and building good environments where they can arise. And I think, like, if we look at rural development, I see these as hanging together. So management for biodiversity, local food, local farming, and creative industries in some sort of package.
Great. Thank you very much for all the questions. Thank you, Anneli, for coming along for this really great, inspiring presentation, really interesting. And thank you also for everyone for your patience with our delay again. So everyone, please join me again and put your hands together for Anneli. And we hope to see you next week when we have Chelsea Geralda Armstrong presenting on forest gardens in British Columbia in Canada. Thursday, 4 p.m. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.